Good morning, everyone. Wow, I have to say, it's such a remarkable moment to be here this morning in this gathering with Professor Michael Walzer and his family and all his good friends. Really delightful, and I'm so happy, Michael, you could make it, and that it was important for you to be here, really. It's definitely a pleasure and an honor for the Leer Jerusalem Institute to host this gathering in honor of Professor Michael Walzer in collaboration with our friends and neighbors at the Israel Academy of Sciences and Humanities. I'm Shai, Lavi, and I'm the director of this institute. For many of the participants in our workshop, Professor Walzer has been a mentor, colleague, and friend. But this workshop is not only intended as an occasion for long-time Israeli acquaintances to celebrate Professor Walzer and his work. Something more seems to me to be at stake today, if only because Michael has left such a lasting imprint on generations of scholars, both those who know him personally and those who do not, across a remarkable range of fields: political theory, Jewish studies, law, history, and philosophy, to mention only a few. In a parallel world to our secular and liberal one, Professor Walzer would be regarded as Gdol Hador, a great leader of the generation, recognized for the breadth and depth of his scholarship, for his charisma as a public intellectual, for his care for students and fellow travelers, for his leadership in many communities, and for his enduring legacy, Ad Mea V'Esrim. One need not be a specialist in Walzer's oeuvre, though such specialists certainly exist, or even fully immersed in his writings to be shaped directly or by osmosis by his major works: Spheres of Justice, Just and Unjust War, the Jewish Political Tradition, and by his critical reflections on liberalism, multiculturalism, state, and religion, and Zionism. It is one of those cases where not only does his name precede him, Shmo Holech Lefanav, but his ideas often arrive even earlier. Unfortunately, I, personally, have had only a few brief encounters with Professor Walzer, but like so many others, I have long been under his spell. In these short opening remarks, I would like to follow a single thread in Walzer's work, one which I see as central to his thought, and no less importantly, essential to the current moment in which we are gathering. I want to draw attention to what I would call, this is my own formulation, and I hope, Michael, you wouldn't disagree, of Walzer's philosophy of the given. The idea that the given is a fundamental attunement combining both a way and a destiny, a method and a set of substantive normative commitments. Professor Walzer does not begin his inquiries by abstracting from concrete life in search for foundational principles, as many philosophers and political thinkers have done. Instead, he begins with a painstaking study of actual historical cases, extracting from them insights about existing, not hypothetical, normative orders. This method recurs throughout his writings. A particular instructive, though perhaps less known example is his book on toleration, a book I have relied on in my own work. For Walzer, tolerance is not an abstract ideal, but a historical and political achievement that enables very different groups to live together in relative peace. He identifies 5 historical constellations that have realized this possibility: multinational empires, international society, consociations, nation-states, and immigrant societies. Each embodies its own understanding of toleration with its promises and its limits. Wisely, Walzer sees little point in ranking them. None is a one-size-fits-all solution. There is an inherent beauty, and so it goes on in other of his works, sort of starting with very concrete historical cases. There is an inherent beauty and modesty in this approach. Reason alone cannot conjure the worlds that human beings must eventually inhabit. For Walzer, this philosophy of the given is not merely a way or a method. It also provides a compass for normative judgment. Starting from the given does not mean suspending moral evaluation, quite to the opposite. While Walzer rejects the imposition of universal external standards, he insists on the legitimacy and necessity of immanent critique, critique grounded in the normative presuppositions internal to each tradition or political order. Combining pragmatism with ethical modesty, he argues that regimes be judged by the standards they set to themselves. But what happens when internal critique reaches its limits and ceases to be productive? How can we know when that point has been reached? When does internal critique stop being part of the solution and becomes part of the problem? These are not questions for Professor Walzer to answer, but they are perhaps the questions that accompany us as we gather to think with him about our present political moment. We are living through a crisis. We, who inhabit a failing international legal and political order. We, who remain committed to liberalism yet witness the rising tide of anti-liberal sentiments. We, who were raised to believe in the possibility of a moral Jewish state, yet stand before the abyss opened in the past 2 years. What happens when deep-rooted traditions are not merely losing ground, but may even have created the conditions of their own undoing? And I know this is a question that Michael has asked in some of his work. This conference is not designed to address these issues directly. It is held in honor of Professor Walzer and his legacy. But what is this legacy if not a call to reflect critically on our current predicaments? It is wholly accidental that this meeting is organized around key works and insights that lie at the heart of our present concerns. Can the Jewish political tradition help us face the challenges confronting both the Jewish state and Jewish communities abroad? How should we understand the paradox of liberation and the ways in which secular liberation movements, including Zionism, have given rise to extreme forms of religious nationalism that undermine their founding aspirations? And what transformations is the international legal order undergoing in its responses to the wars in Ukraine and Gaza? Is a normative framework built after the Second World War coming to an end? One might argue that in all three arenas, the Jewish tradition, the Israeli state, and the international order, we confront a common challenge. We can't imagine the future of these normative regimes apart from the historical traditions that form them. There is no Archimedean point, as Walzer has taught us, outside them from which to think, and yet it is increasingly unclear to what extent these traditions are still available to us, or to what extent they are now failing us. Is it possible that the vessels have been broken? Today we celebrate Professor Walzer's 90th birthday, a little bit belated. We were supposed to be here a few months ago. Celebrate his 90th birthday. Pirkei Avot teaches that each decade brings its own renewal. Ben 80 legvuot, ben 90 lasuach. Reading lasuach with a shin smalit, following the rabbis, we might translate this loosely as at 80 to heroic deeds, and 90 to deep and meaningful conversations. May this gathering be such an occasion, an opportunity for meaningful conversations through which we continue to learn with and from Professor Walzer, to learn new ways of interpreting, reinterpreting, and pushing the traditions we inhabit towards new possibilities, less catastrophic, perhaps even more hopeful. I would like to thank all of you for being here this morning. The room is already almost full, and so we anticipate that we might need to move downstairs where there's more room as people will join. I'd like to thank the Leer Jerusalem team for organizing this and making this possible, and especially my colleague Ona Yoeli Benvenisti. Ona, are you here? Here you are. Thank you, Ona. I also want to express my deepest gratitude to Professor Yuli Tamir, Yuli, for actually coming up with this idea and making sure that it happens and happens the way it should happen. Thank you, Yuli. And together with the Israel Academy of Sciences and the Humanities, we were joined by Professor Avishai Margalit, who's also here in organizing this. Thank you so much, Avishai. And I would like to ask Yuli to share with us a few words of greetings, and then followed by Moshe. Thank you.
Good morning. This is really just greetings. I'll give my paper later. You said, Shai, that this is not just a gathering of friends or family. Actually, it is. And I think it's a way to celebrate something very deep Michael taught us, not only about political theory, but about the way things should be, and about putting family and friends and community first. So Michael's enormous contribution, 27 books, right? 300 articles, one wife, which is a great achievement. I still remember your dedication to Judy, הלכו שניים יחדיו בלתי אם נועדו, which is probably the right thing to say, and the wonderful Walzer family. We are all here because we are grateful, I think, to Michael, not only because of his academic work, but because of his ability to create a community of scholars. Many of us have been part of this community and have learned a lot through this partnership. And it is therefore, I think, a celebration of something very unique. Maybe we can call it local universalism, placing liberalism in context, in the Israeli context, and allowing us to reflect about ourselves and about Israel in ways that I think are very unique to Michael's work. So as the day will evolve, I think we'll meet more and more participants who are part of the Walzer circle and who all know one thing that we learned during dinner with Janet that is common to all of us. We all believe that we have together, we will never have to walk alone. So thank you for being here and sharing this wonderful day. And I'm so glad that the Iranian, the Houthim, the Hamas, nobody managed to prevent us from being here today. So thank you, Van Leer, and Shai and Ona for making it happen. And thank you, Michael and Judy, for making it and coming here. So thank you very much.
Well, it's really a pleasure and a great honor to welcome Michael Walzer. I'm here speaking in the name of the Israeli Academy of Science and the Humanities, but also as expressing both my gratitude and debt to Michael through all my intellectual life. Shai mentioned Michael's contributions and achievements as one of the really greatest political theorists of our times. And I want to say two things actually that are central to features of all your work. I mean, you have done so much work in so many essential questions of political theory, just and unjust wars, spheres of justice, the nature of social criticism and interpretation, toleration, the relationship between the universal and the particular. But in all this vast corpus, there are two things that are striking. One is just the elegance of your thought and writing. It's really, really such a beautiful experience to read them, because they're straightforward, they're deep, they're elegant, they're thoughtful. And the second here is something that Shai already mentioned, is that I would say Michael is the wisest of all political theories. Wisdom is what you learn from him. You don't, when you read, there's no analytical fireworks, no thought experiments of twin earth. but just wise observation and contemplation on the concrete. And what's striking is your resistance to the temptation, overcoming the temptation to finding the one unified principle that will direct us, either utilitarian, maximizing preferences, or the Kantian categorical imperative, or rights-based theories. It's always complex and concrete, but never degenerating into relativism. It's a wise exploration of essential questions. I want to say something and end my comments here. There is something very important that this celebration of your life work is happening here in Jerusalem. You were always concerned with the country. You were always engaged. Actually, I was thinking that you're always running Israel in your head all the time. I'm doing it myself as well, so sometimes even we form the government. And there is, but this concern takes, there is a beautiful verse in Proverbs, I think, that captures that concerns. Tova tochecha megula me'ahava mesuteret. It's an open reproach is or rebuke is preferable than concealing love. And I think there is something very powerful. Mainly that, and that's a reflection on your view of how social criticism has to be performed. In talking with you, we Israelis never felt that you are like a kind of a super ego landing on us from far away. That's an experience we had many times. It was always the question, and that's what your challenges was, do you stand up to the best ideal image of yourself? And I think in these times where we are failing to do it colossally, dark days of failure, your presence here is even more important and comforting for us. So really, Michael, thank you so much for everything you have given us. And it's really wonderful to welcome you here engaging with your work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yuli and Moshe. We're now going to move to our first panel. So I invite Professor Shai.
So it is a privilege and honor to open this conference dedicated celebrating Professor Michael Walzer's 19th birthday. As one of the foremost political theories and public intellectuals, his monumental contributions to Jewish political thought will be the focus of the first session. We are fortunate to have his students, colleagues, friends, many of whom were part of the founding group of the Hartman Institute in Jerusalem, and my teachers, where they developed unique perspectives on Jewish studies as well as to the burning issues of Israel as a Jewish democratic state. So after hearing the speakers, we will open the floor for discussion. So I urge all of you to keep their talks within 15-20 minutes to the maximum, so we will be able to have a fruitful discussion. Our first speaker is Menachem Lorberbaum. Menachem is a professor of philosophy and Jewish thought at Tel Aviv University and one of the editors of the Jewish political tradition from its very beginning. Menachem, please.
I'll stand up. Years ago, I heard from my teacher, Michael, that his teacher told him that they have to stand up when you speak politics. It's a great story, and I won't go into the details. It took me a while to fish it out, but it's one of the great ones. And really, I want to begin, first of all, by saying, by giving thanks. stand in front of Michael. It's like standing in front of my parents and an entire lifetime. A project that began with a small conference in Jerusalem, with preparing by studying in our house when Yemima was only a baby, my oldest daughter, and now we look at them all, at grandchildren, at great grandchildren. It's and we think about. I think about a journey, a life's journey, and there's so much to tell. I remember once walking with Michael. I think it must have been in one of our walks in the afternoon at the Institute, and I asked Michael about the Kennedy administration in Vietnam. And Michael, as you all know, was very active in the anti-war movement. And I asked him, but how do you understand the Kennedy administration? I mean, you read McGeorge Bundy's work, you read Robert McFarlane's work, and you see these are serious people. How can they fall in the same trap that the French fell into? And Michael said to me, you don't understand. They were Machiavellian princes. They thought they knew. It's one of many, many stories I've taken, of moments of wisdom that I think are crucial. There are many people that think they know, and we don't. And I want to share a bit with you a concern of my own, a deep debt to Michael, and something I've spoken a lot to Noam Zohar about. And we wrote 3 volumes of the Jewish political tradition. We edited them. We spent a lifetime doing it. And one of the things that struck me in the past 2-3 years have been that I knew when I wrote those books where I was writing from. I no longer know where I'm writing from. I'm not sure that I have a clear sense of where my political society is, my civil society. And what's all the more strange is that this is not only true about Israel, where I've grown up, but it's true of the United States, where I was born, and I am also a citizen of the United States. I remember teaching at Penn a couple of years ago after Donald Trump was voted in president, and I came to teach the next morning in Philadelphia, and my students were mostly mourning. Philadelphia is a very democratic city, and I said to them, this was we're seeing history happen, and we have to reflect on history. It doesn't mean it's going our way. Nobody's giving us any kind of assurance that things will happen. I told them at the time that I thought that it's true that everything is fake about Donald Trump except the fact that he's president, and that's sufficient. That makes a real difference, as we know and as we see in the world today. So these things are on my mind. It's because we succeeded in writing 3 amazing volumes that basically translate a good deal of Jewish learning into the world, that we are, that I feel at least, deeply stuck with regard to the 4th volume of Politics and History, actually, a good place to begin is an argument we once had. We had a couple of arguments about what to do with different volumes. Now, if you notice, each one of the volumes of the Jewish political tradition have a title of one concept: authority, membership, community. The fourth volume is a volume that I wanted to call sovereignty, but Michael and Noam felt that it was wrong, and I was outvoted. And I still think that at the end of the day, this is the deep question of that particular volume, and I'd like to share with you two different statements that kind of explain at least where my own thoughts, and I feel that I owe not only my teacher and my colleagues but also our readers an account of what it is to be engaged politically. The first is a sentence from a famous sentence by Leo Strauss from his preface to the English translation of Spinoza's Critique of Religion. And he famously writes, the author was a young Jew born and raised in Germany who found himself in the grip of the theological political predicament. This is one of these enticing statements by Strauss that I never fully understood, and I'm still enigmatically gripped by it. Michael always says to me that he's religiously tone deaf, and so this is like one of the gaps between us. But Michael is religiously tone deaf, but goes every Shabbos to shul in the morning, and he has a say about the parasha, and he will give a Dval Torah if there's no one else to do it. It's a deep commitment. It's a different kind of commitment. The second thing I want to share with you, but I do feel in that grip, and I don't know after the past war what is to be expected from a volume that reflects on politics and history in the Jewish political tradition. I really don't know where I'm writing from, and what we have that would contribute there the way I think the other volumes do contribute. And I'd like to share with you something that I read last night, and I thought that this is apt. This is something that Freud wrote in 1916 in an essay on transience. I think it's a very powerful essay, and something that reflects an important part also of our experience, at least my experience here. A year later, the war broke out, says Freud, and robbed the world of its beauties. It destroyed not only the beauty of the countrysides through which it passed and the works of art which it met on its path, but it also shattered our pride in the achievements of our civilization. Our admiration for many philosophers and artists, and I would say rabbis, Talmidei Chachamim, and our hopes of a final triumph over the difference between nations and races. It tarnished the lofty impartiality of our science. It revealed our instincts in all their nakedness and let loose the evil spirits within us, which we thought we had been tamed forever by centuries of continuous education by the noblest minds. It made our country small again and made the rest of the world far remote. It robbed us of very much that we had loved and showed us how ephemeral were many things that we had regarded as changeless. These are haunting words by Freud, and I've reread them, reading the book of a friend who has recently departed, a friend of many of ours, Jonathan Leer, in his wonderful book on imagining the end. It's a book about mourning and the importance of mourning. And Jonathan writes, there is something personal here, not just that Freud is personally affected, but that this somehow has to do with who he is. Freud is ashamed. He says that war showed us how ephemeral were many things that we had regarded as changeless. But that alone cannot explain shattered pride. It must have been that he himself and his intended readers were somehow invested, not just in these cultural achievements, but in their being eternal or changeless. The narcissism of this group seemed to have been entangled in an illusion that civilization is itself an endless journey, a long trip in a civilizing direction, one that moves towards peace and mutual understanding, in which increased knowledge is a civilizing force, and reason and creative art promote social and psychic harmony. On this image, civilization opens indefinitely into the future and in the direction of the good, what Moshe called before the superego that likes falling upon us many times. War does not show scientific results false, but it does destroy the illusion that science, or Judaism if you want, facilitates peaceful progress for all, and it shows how it is used to destroy civilization. And I think that these are important words, because the reason that we have to stand when we speak politics is because we want to speak about the public good. We want to speak about the price of the decisions we make. We want to be able, certainly if at my age, I would say, how much more so at Michael's age, to draw a horizon of significance, of meaning, of importance for our children. And we stand in front of moments of collapse. How are we to deal with moments of collapse? How can we build? How can we rebuild? How can we speak meaningfully when we know how deep the price is? These are the questions I'm faced with, and I have to say that time and again, whenever I take the pen in hand, I feel it falls. But I want to thank my teacher for showing the way. Many years ago, I sat here as a young student, here and downstairs in the big hall. I heard Michael speaking. This must be about 45 years ago. And I said, ooh, I want to be his student. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Menachem. Our second speaker is Moshe Halbertal. Moshe is a professor of philosophy and Jewish thought at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and professor of law at New York University and a member of the National Academy of Sciences. And he's going to speak on In God's Shadow, Idolatry and Politics.
Well, thank you very much. I know that both Noam and Menachem, the editors or the co-editors of the volumes on the Jewish political tradition, will focused on that. I thought of talking about the issue or the book, Michael's book titled "In God's Shadow: Politics in the Hebrew Bible." And I think, and I want to raise what I think is an essential question in the tradition concerning Jewish political thought, raising maybe a question to Michael in engaging in a conversation. So in the book, I think Michael touches upon the most essential question of political theology, biblical political theology, and it takes the following way. I will cast it in my own terminology of idolatry and politics, but I think it's a reconstruction of Michael's argument, which is the following. The prohibition of worshipping other gods, or the prohibition on idolatry, postulates the following prohibition, which is humans cannot ascribe to human institutions, to natural forces, attributes that are exclusive to God, and they cannot engage in, you would say, mechvot, gestures that are exclusive to God. The transfer of those exclusive realm of worship to other elements constitute the ultimate biblical sin. Right? That's the core essence in some ways of what marks biblical world from its pagan environment. The prohibition of ascribing divine attributes and assuming a worshipful attitude to other forces, humans, institutions, nature, etc. Now when we get to politics, and that's the core of the problem, when it gets to politics, the question then comes the following. In the political realm, what attributes and what gestures are exclusive to God? When does political authority becomes a form of worship? Now it's, by the way, in the human relation, or you might say in a different way, when does deification starts? After all, we are all engaged in relations of authority, and there are different rituals of flattery to people who are, who are your bosses, etc., etc. You serve tea, you do other things. At what point those gestures become a form of worship? What do you have to ascribe to that person, making that person a god? And the line of deification, as I will show, becomes a very essential question in both biblical political thought and also in the history of Jewish political theology. So there is a line in biblical political theory or thought that I think Michael depicts very powerfully, that makes politics an exclusive realm of divine prerogative. Right? So you take the book of Judges, right? The book of Judges resists this idea of kingship. When the people approach Gideon to become a king, he said, Lo ani imshol bachem, lo bni imshol bechem, Adonai imshol bechem, etc., etc. The idea of kingship is exclusive to God. Hence, humans cannot establish essential features of sovereignty, which is the power to draft and the power to tax. In the book of Judges, all life is really, in some ways, apolitical, in the sense it depends on charismatic leaders emerging, responding to a crisis, calling the people to volunteer. Usually not everybody shows up, but they don't have the power to enforce draft or to enforce tax, hence to build a standing army or to preserve the continuation of power through hereditary structures of kingship. So there is a sense of you might say, what Buber was very attracted towards, although Michael is very skeptical, is kind of this divine anarchy. There is a second feature where the depolitization of life emerges, and that's a feature that Michael again explores very deeply, is the resistance of the prophets to treaties with superpowers of the area. Right? You would say, well, Israel, the small kingship has to survive between those superpowers by attaching itself to one power, be it Egypt, be it Assyria, be it Babylon, etc., etc. And there is a prophetic voice claiming that there is that sort of treaty, achieving a vassal standing vis-a-vis those power, it constitutes idolatry. After all, God is your sovereign, and you are, might say, especially in the Deuteronomistic structure, the covenant is thoroughly political covenant. as we said, and this is I mean, Michael looks at it very critically, or asks, is there politics in the Bible, given the suffocating presence of God's shadow over real political life? Now, again, this question was essential to Jewish history, right? A very crucial moment of this question itself happened and led to the destruction of Jerusalem is when the Zealots, and when Josephus describes the Zealots' ideology in year 60 around, their claim was the following. He says, well, you rabbis and everybody are objecting the worship of the emperor. Everybody objects sacrificing to the emperor, and all of Jerusalem is in uproar when the imperial image gets into the temple. What about paying taxes? Isn't that a form of worship? Isn't that a form of deification? Now, the problem is the following, if we want to put it conceptually. The broader the exclusive political attributes belong to God, the narrower the possibility of arranging hierarchical political structures. That's the tension at stake. And I think Michael cuts to the core of the problem in biblical political theology in stating that issue. Now, this is an internal question, and I want to raise the following thought and the following, in some ways, question, which is there is a different biblical moment in which this failure of God is the king, becomes so intolerable politically, right? At the beginning of the book of Samuel, when the people want a king. And that's a moment where, against all the political theology of the Near East, where for them the king is a god, right? If in Egypt, in Assyria is an incarnation of God, but the idea is that politics or the king is part of the furniture of the cosmos. It's actually not a historical figure. Here's a story that kingship emerges as part of history, not a mythic force of nature that precedes the nation. It's actually part of the historical crisis of the nation through time. And there is now a very interesting new formulation in some ways that opens up the possibility of politics. And then we'll raise the question, what is then deification? Which is the following formula. God is not the king, right? There is a king, actually, and the king is not a god, right? Here's the political space of the book of Samuel. And the king not being a god, that's a feature of two things. Really, the king has the power to draft, the power to tax. There is a heredity continuation of power. But there are two things that he cannot do, which is legislate. He is not a legislative force. He's not the source of the authority of the law. He's under the law. And also doesn't have any role in ritual, which is very, very alien, let's say, to the political theology of the Near East, because if God is part of the furniture of the cosmos, he's responsible for the Nile to rise, etc., etc. He's an essential element. Here comes an Israelite king, the first two kings, who are, by the way, not mythic in the sense that they don't precede history. They respond to historical circumstances, and they are narrowed in the sense that, not being gods, they're narrowed and deprived of two essential features of monarchy in the mythic sense, which is the power to command laws, to issue laws, and the priesthood and the command of ritual. Now, I want to say one thing. I think that moment in history, for me at least, opened up the space for real political thought. That's the book of Samuel, still, in my opinion, the best book written in the Hebrew language. Among other things, because it's perception, an inquiry on the structural vulnerabilities of kingship and politics, in the way that we don't have precedent in ancient Near East stuff, because after all, the god is a king, the king is a god, the emperor is a god. He's not inspected, closely inspected in terms of the vulnerabilities of the structure, etc., etc. And you have an open space complex, very complex open space that becomes in some ways a great political document, because it frees itself from the shadow of God by declaring that God is not a king and the king is not a god. Now, I mean, the lessons that that book teaches us about structural vulnerabilities of politics are very deep. If this is the case, then you ask yourself, and this is a modern question, or a question we all have to struggle with. If the very fact of political hierarchy doesn't constitute as such deification, right? You know, Roman soldiers, especially young Christian Roman soldiers, because the Roman religion was such a civic religion, they always had problems, and they write Tertullian. He says, well, there are soldiers in the Roman army, and they want to know what part of the kind of civic ritual of the state constitutes idolatry, right? And they struggle with that, and that's a constant struggle at the moment in which that decision is being made, right? That there is a king who's not a god and God is not the king. A very fascinating question within the book of Samuel, after God, in some ways, against his own will, is forced to resign from being a king, and then he says, well, you're going to have a king, that's fine, it's part of your ongoing betrayal of mine that has a history. When you're going to cry, I'm not going to be there, etc. But God never fully resigned, right? He doesn't go to the desert. Even Ben Gurion going to the desert, this didn't constitute a full resignation from politics. Then God has to reconstitute his own role within the political world that poses a very interesting question. But I want to focus then on the question of that move in political theology within the biblical strand. And then you ask yourself, then what constitutes deification? It's not the fact that there is a king. It's not the fact that the king has authority to draft and to tax. But it is one, I think, feature, very important feature, which is that deification is constituted by the fact that the king cannot command and issue laws. He's not a legislative force. Deification is constituted by making the political realm as the ultimate normative, unquestionable authority that cannot be challenged, right? That will be, you might say, a modern variation of the problem. But a certain, I would say, where does the shadow of God productively enters the political realm? As understanding that the ultimate political sin is deification, right? To deify the state and political powers. So we have, I suggest the following. By way of a question. Given that Michael has, I think, put his finger on the deepest question of biblical political theology, right? So the deepest question, which is the realm of politics, hierarchical politics, a realm of deification under the prohibition of idolatry? And that's serious political theology, not in the Schmidian sense of political theology. He wrote a whole book on political theology without the category of idolatry. And that's an impossible project. That's what makes him so monstrous, because it doesn't have the category of idolatry. But there is a question now. Given that there is an opening given that there is an opening of political space. By the way, again, an opening that allowed what I think one of the first, most deepest political tracts ever written because of that opening. When does deification start? And from the removal of the king and from his role, which is the most common role in the ancient Near East, as the source of the law, being under Torah, being under the law. What's driving this idea of deification is perceiving the political entity as the ultimate authority, which is actually one way of assuming what is the divine. So I just want to raise for our conversation this question by way of exploring the problems of biblical political thought. And also, again, I mean, this is resonating into the current and modern political problem, which is at the heart of the deterioration of political structures, is deification. And then we all have to struggle with the following question: when does a political entity becomes idolatrous? And Michael, I think you, in this book, In God's Shadow, you really opened up this question in the most powerful, deep way, the way you opened up many questions. So many thanks.
Thank you very much, Moshe. Our third speaker is Yuli Cooper. Yuli is a professor in the Political Science Department at Tel Aviv University, where she also directs the Roth Institute for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism and Racism. She is the author of Secular Powers, Humility in Modern Political Thought, and the co-editor with Samuel Brody of The King is in the Field Essays in Modern Jewish Political Thought. She intends to discuss two central tensions that characterize the Jewish political tradition as constructed by Walzer: the tension between exile and sovereignty, galut and ribonut, and the tension between messianism and the political conception of the Exodus. Please.
Thanks. I first met Michael when I was an innocent graduate student at Berkeley trying to study Jewish political thought, and since then he's always been a gracious and supportive mentor, so it's very moving for me to be here today. By way of introduction, I want to read a passage from the work of Simon Dubnov, the historian and theoretical architect of Eastern European diaspora nationalism. In this passage, Dubnov imagines the speech which, what he calls the providence of history, delivered to the Jews in 70 CE upon the destruction of the temple and subsequent dispersion. This is the speech that Dubnov imagines. He writes, "Now you may go forth. Your character has been sufficiently tempered. You can bear the bitterest of hardships. You are equipped with an inexhaustible store of energy, and you can live for centuries, yea, for thousands of years, under conditions that would prove the bane of other nations in less than a single century. State, territory, army, the external attributes of national power are for you superfluous luxury. Go out into the world to prove that a people can continue to live without these attributes, solely and alone through the strength of spirit, welding its widely scattered particles into one firm organism. And the Jewish people went forth and proved it." That's the end of the quotation. So I'm going to explain the theoretical significance of this passage in a minute, but I want to explain why I chose to begin with it, why it came to mind when I was preparing for this joyous occasion. When invited to speak about Walzer's formative contributions to the study of Jewish political thought, I recalled a conversation many years ago in which Michael confessed that Dubnov was one of his boyhood heroes. Upon reflection, I cannot verify the accuracy of this memory. I cannot discount the possibility that the remembered conversation is in fact a figment of my imagination, a creative reconstruction of what I expected or hoped that Michael would say about Dubnov. Michael is here. He can confirm or deny whether Dubnov was in fact the object of youthful admiration. For my purposes, however, the memory's accuracy is less important than what it reveals about Michael's significance and stature. Whether this memory is accurate or apocryphal, my remembered/imagined linkage of Michael and Dubnov reflects their shared concerns, methods, and eminence as scholars of Jewish politics. Michael and Dubnov both anchor political thought in historical evidence, narrative, and analysis. In works such as Just and Unjust Wars, Walzer offers a powerful, dare I say Jewish, rejoinder to the abstractions of ideal theory. Moreover, Michael and Dubnov are both connected critics whose research informs their public engagement and political activism. More important, both have played foundational roles in the academic study of Jewish politics. In the Jewish political tradition anthologies and a series of influential monographs on the biblical inheritance, Michael has established an old-new Jewish canon in critical dialogue with Western political theory. These works exhibit an astonishing breadth of erudition, mobilizing philosophical sophistication and methodological inventiveness to curate a conversation between multiple periods and genres of Jewish thought. Like Dubnov before him, Michael weds scholarly rigor to the commitments of connected criticism, excavating resources for enhancing democracy and Jewish pluralism. As the figure most instrumental in making Jewish political thought a recognized and vital academic discipline, Michael's standing rivals that of his predecessor, Dubnov, whose insights he revived. Dubnov was the first thinker to defend the claim that enables scholarly research on Jewish politics. As the passage with which I began illustrates, Dubnov insists that exile does not constitute an exit from history and politics. Rather, political autonomy is possible even in the absence of sovereign power and territorial concentration, what Dubnov calls state, territory, and army. The Jewish case proves, quote, that a people can continue to live without these attributes, unquote, this is Dubnov, exercising self-rule within a rich network of local institutions such as the Kahal. Working in this Dubnovian register, Michael has challenged us to develop more expansive conceptions of politics. Michael's point of departure in the Jewish political tradition in the first volume is the ubiquity of politics. Against critics who presume that statelessness rendered Jews apolitical, Michael contends that, quote, politics is pervasive with or without state sovereignty, unquote. Indeed, the claim regarding the existence of a Jewish political tradition presupposes a conception of politics sufficiently elastic to encompass diasporic peoples. In this sense, Michael's interpretations of Jewish texts promise more than connected criticism or a usable past. They hold out the possibility of a radical reorientation of foundational political concepts, challenging the priority that Western traditions accord to sovereignty. Michael has done more than anyone to orchestrate a critical conversation between Western political theory and the diasporic discourses that are the condition of possibility for the existence of a Jewish political tradition. Yet, and here I'm going to gesture in an Oedipal direction, yet befitting his position as Dubnov's student and heir, Michael betrays a somewhat Oedipal ambivalence regarding the diasporic complexion of Jewish politics. The tension between diaspora and sovereignty lies at the heart of the tradition which Michael reconstructs. As an interpreter of Jewish texts, Michael vacillates regarding the viability and desirability of politics without what Dubnov called state, territory, and army. This vacillation is in contrast to Michael's consistent and emphatic stance regarding the other opposition constitutive of the Jewish political tradition, the tension between messianic and mundane politics. So I want to start with Michael's consistent advocacy of mundane politics before returning to what I consider his ambivalent Dubnovianism. On Michael's interpretation, the tension between two modes of politics, messianism and what he calls exodus politics, is constitutive of Jewish political traditions. Michael opposes messianism, which inspires a toxic mix of recklessness and passivity, to the active and participatory politics he advocates. Michael valorizes the Sisyphean hard work of canvassing, marching, fundraising, coalition building, and tedious organizational meetings that exodus politics requires. More important, Michael defends exodus politics as a form of radicalism, namely the radicalism which is most effective and most congruent with democratic commitments. Intervening in contemporary Jewish debates, Michael cautions against messianism's seductive allure, arguing instead for a this-worldly politics inspired by a democratic reinterpretation of the Exodus narrative. Although Michael is consistently opposed to redemptive politics, he seems genuinely torn between the competing claims of diasporic and sovereign modes of politics. Again, in the Jewish political tradition, Michael's point of departure is Dubnovian. namely the pervasiveness of politics with or without state sovereignty. Michael celebrates the Kahal as a unique achievement, what he calls the polis of exilic Jewry and the miracle of Jewish politics. This classification of the Kahal reflects a diasporic perspective in which sovereignty and the state do not exhaust the realm of politics. In subsequent volumes of the Jewish Political Tradition anthology, however, Michael seems less inclined to challenge sovereignty's historical and conceptual priority. In the third volume, dedicated to the notion of community, Michael adopts a more qualified evaluation of the Kahal's political robustness. Admittedly, Jewish power and independence were limited in diaspora, yet acknowledging the sober realities of Jewish history need not cause us to imply that diasporic institutions were less than fully political. Even at his most enthusiastic, Michael seems unsure whether Jewish texts can or should generate alternative conceptions of politics. In this sense, Michael is an ambivalent Dubnovian, and this ambivalence only sharpens over the years. Sustained immersion in the Jewish corpus inspires persistent doubts regarding whether there is anything legitimately political about this tradition. These doubts appear to confirm Michael's fundamental convictions about politics, which at times seem more Greek than diasporic Jewish. In Spheres of Justice, now we're going back to 1983, Walzer states, quote, "Sovereignty is a permanent feature of political life," unquote. Strikingly, Michael sounds a similar note in God's Shadow, a book which was published in 2012, and as we've just heard, is a book that laments the prominence of theocratic doctrines in the Hebrew Bible. Walzer deems theocratic doctrines anti-political because they deny or erode human sovereignty. The charge of anti-politics presupposes a Western definition of politics that affirms the permanence of sovereignty. Indeed, in God's Shadow, Michael glosses political theory and the concept of politics as Greek inventions. My point is not to contest Michael's diagnosis regarding the dangers of theocracy. Rather, I'm trying to foreground the definition of politics animating Michael's prescient warning against theocratic beliefs. Admittedly, this Greek definition resurfaces during an interpretation of the Hebrew Bible, which Michael has always considered less politically generative than rabbinic discourse. Yet by the time we get to In God's Shadow, Michael's criticism of Jewish anti-politics extends to the rabbis themselves who, and these are Michael's words, were denied the opportunities of sovereignty and consequently avoided politics. Although Michael attenuates the link between national independence and political agency, the rabbis display greater political acumen than the biblical authors, he does not relinquish sovereignty as a political paradigm. In short, we have wandered far from our Dubnovian beginnings. What explains Michael's growing reservations regarding the tradition's diasporic underpinnings? At the risk of indulging in armchair psychology, I will venture two possible explanations. The first possibility is that the encounter with Jewish texts did not change Michael's fundamental convictions about politics, which have always affirmed the permanence of sovereignty. The second possible explanation is that Michael's doubts about the political robustness of Jewish traditions reflect his profound disappointment with the direction that Jewish and Israeli politics have taken in the years since the Jewish political tradition's inception. With the demise of the Oslo process, the theocratic tendencies against which Michael warned have captivated large segments of Israeli society. In the Netanyahu era, it became increasingly difficult to sustain the optimistic premise which animated the Jewish political tradition anthologies, namely that traditional sources could be mobilized to bolster liberal and democratic voices within Israeli politics. The ascendance of the populist right made the caution against messianic temptations much more urgent than the painstaking work of excavating resources for projects of connected criticism. Political pessimism could easily make one less sanguine about the tradition and its formative assumptions. Today, the mood is significantly darker. The October 7th attacks and the subsequent destruction of Gaza arguably constitute the brutal nadir of a bloody, interminable conflict. Moreover, in an alarming twist, the Jewish question has resurfaced as one of the defining political controversies of our time. These developments have inspired an unprecedented crisis of confidence in the political regimes under which the majority of Jews have lived since World War II, the nation-state, and the liberal state. It is no longer tenable to believe that Jewish modernity reached its inevitable conclusion with the establishment of a Jewish state and the integration of Jews in liberal states. These internal Jewish debates play out against the backdrop of a broader democratic emergency. In many countries, Israel and the United States included, the foundational institutions of democratic society are under concerted attack and have proved alarmingly vulnerable to authoritarian capture. Since October 7th, we have been forced to acknowledge that the nation state is not insulated from the dynamics of Jewish history, nor is the liberal state uniquely hospitable to Jews, and neither regime is immune from democratic backsliding. At this crisis moment, profound pessimism about the robustness and stability of Western political traditions is warranted. So today, we're not just pessimistic about the Jewish sources, we're also pessimistic about Western traditions. The brand of liberalism that Michael hoped to cultivate in Israel appears increasingly fragile in its former strongholds. These dislocations augur a radical transformation of prevailing ideological configurations, and I would argue that they have shattered the default status that Western traditions founded upon sovereignty once enjoyed. Suddenly, diasporic traditions seem less anomalous and less deficient. With the collapse of the liberal order, Dubnovian assumptions deserve a second look. Fortunately, time constraints prevent me from elaborating upon or defending this seemingly fanciful suggestion. What is incontrovertible is that Michael's work provides us with the conceptual and practical resources needed to navigate this moment of peril and opportunity for Jewish politics. Whether one accepts or challenges the permanence of sovereignty, whether one seeks to rehabilitate the nation state or transform it a la Dubnov, we are only able to conduct these pressing debates because of Michael's unparalleled contributions to the study of Jewish politics. More important, the defense of Exodus politics assumes heightened significance at a moment that demands mass popular mobilization to combat democratic backsliding. Michael has taught, practiced, and embodied this demanding but powerful mode of democratic engagement. Today, Michael's mundane form of radicalism provides a powerful antidote to the revolutionary zeal of authoritarian populists. For this reason, Michael is a childhood idol for many in this room, myself included. In these dark times, it is incumbent upon us, Michael's no longer youthful disciples, to hone techniques of Exodus politics and invest them with new forms of charisma. Perhaps it is wishful thinking, but I have to believe that we can find ways to re-enchant these emphatically mundane modes of politics and mobilize them to bolster the egalitarian convictions that Michael has so eloquently defended. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Yuli. And our last speaker is Noam Zohar. Noam is Professor Emeritus in the Department of Philosophy at Bar-Ilan University and Senior Research Fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute here in Jerusalem. In the realm of Jewish studies, his work is on rabbinics and on philosophy of halakha. In the realm of philosophy, his work is on moral and political philosophy, with an emphasis on applied ethics, particularly bioethics and the morality of warfare. Much of his work seeks to combine both realms, as in his role as co-editor of the series on Jewish political tradition. So Noam is going to speak. The title is "This Our Tradition, Commitment and Scholarship in the Jewish Political Tradition."
Thank you, Onit. Well, if we were able to project the title, I would ask you to read it, because it can come in two intonations. I mean, the second part of the title is Scholarship and Commitment in the Jewish Political Tradition, but the first is a question. I'll first try to read it monotone, like a robot. Is this our tradition? Now, one way of intoning that is this our tradition? And that will be part of what I will address. And in a different tone is this our tradition? And that's another aspect of what I will try. That's the subtitle about scholarship and commitment. So first of all, when they talk about, is this our tradition? I'll come back to this later, but this is the second meaning. Like, are we doing scholarship objectively, like the editors of the encyclopedia after the revolution in France, or whatever they purported to do? I mean, that's one way of scholarship which tries to be objective. And should it be objective, but especially in a project like the Jewish political tradition? Well, for Michael, it certainly has never been an issue of detached scholarship. I heard from you this issue about being tone deaf to religion or what. Well, all of Michael's work almost has been about religion, but beginning with the religion, well, the biblical religion, but of the Puritans, right? In Geneva and what. So, but then moving to the biblical Exodus as revolution. And Michael told me more than once very proudly, my grandchildren, they didn't come along this time, right? No. He said, my grandchildren are 5th generation Reform Jews. With pride. So the importance of carrying on this identity is very significant, and trying to engage the Jewish political tradition beyond the Bible with Talmudic and rabbinic texts. Michael required partners with yeshiva training like Menachem and myself, but no less than that, we required him to teach us to look at these materials with the eyes of political thought and political theory. So, if we are editing a project on the Jewish political tradition as our tradition, in fact, we were asked sometimes, why are all the commentators Jews? I mean, can't you invite commentary on these texts from non-Jews? It's an interesting question. So it's like an in-house conversation, people who were somehow within the tradition. Of course, if we are inviting only Jews, we will have to decide who is a Jew. But okay, one more comment about that. I should say that Julie's very inspiring and depressing, but impressive survey made me feel even more guilty that we're not finished yet with the 4th volume, which would have led your narrative, I think, in a different way. So is this our tradition? Okay, so that means when we're editing this and we feel that this is something that to which we are committed and we want to enable the conversation to agree, what do you do with materials which are to you anathema, which are part of the tradition? Now, of course, such a project is pluralistic, and that's fine, right? You don't have to agree with everything. You gladly include many voices and portray an argument, Beit Midrash, a whole scholarly realm. But what do you do with voices which are really terrible? Do you include them? Do you exclude them? So when in the end of volume 2 we were dealing with materials about Gentiles and non-Jewish citizens in a Jewish state, we had to deal with what to do with the materials which were not so nice as Rabbi Chaim David Halevi. What do you do with really, really bad stuff? Do you include it and say, well, then people will study this, and who knows with whom they will agree? Do you exclude it and then make yourself less credible? In fact, you lose all credibility because you seem to be selective and presenting the tradition in a very skewed manner. So what you do is, and these are materials which are normally beyond the realm of pluralism and maybe even beyond the realm of toleration. Voices which ought not to be allowed to be elected to the Knesset or be ministers in the government. So what do you do with that kind of voice, with that sort of voices from the tradition? Well, we have, to the texts in the book, we have headnotes and introductions. So one of the headnotes there reads, Yitzhak Ginsburg. We quote a text of Yitzhak Ginsburg, and in the headnote we say, we criticize him for combining two incompatible elements and producing something evil thereby, but we don't use the word evil. We say, together these inspire a contemporary ideology of Jewish supremacy in Israel. Okay, now I should tell you, we're all responsible for everything, but mostly the head notes are produced by Menachem and me, and Michael then fixes them, and mostly the text of the introductions are produced by Michael. So I should also read to you from the introduction to the same chapter, where Michael addresses the same voice, and he says, just a minute, sorry, I need to get the right image here. In contrast to Herzog, this is the grandfather, okay? And Halevi, and so on. And he brings about Ginsburg, he says, Ginsburg follows Maimonides in rejecting an inclusive fellowship, but who also invokes an older mystical or semi-mystical racism, which Maimonides would surely have repudiated. So I just want to mention the gradations here. In the head note, we tried to disown this by calling it Jewish supremacy. And Michael was more straightforward, and I think more correct in calling it racism. Now, what about people for whom labeling something correctly as supremacy or racism is not a turnoff? Who won't hear that this is a criticism, a severe criticism? Well, those people we can't, should I say, are beyond hope, or we're not going to convince them whatever we say. But the hope is at least that as taking a stand as editors and labeling this kind of material for what it is, while trying to translate it accurately and explain its sources, and we have cross-references to the chapter on Jewish election and to other sections where you can see that this is not just an only singular surprise voice, but it has roots from which it grew in the tradition. That's part of the work of scholarship, but it is also part of the work of asserting that this is our tradition, this is part of our tradition, and we also are committed to arguing against or taking a position against the problematic aspects. Now, lest it appear as if this is all a work of struggling against nefarious elements in our tradition, I will move on to something nicer, in a sense. Michael has been urging us, if we're not yet finishing the fourth chapter, let's at least finish the fourth volume. Let's at least finish the chapter on war. And that's about 80% done, so we should really do that. And this brings us back to the chapter on sieges and blockades in Michael's Just and Unjust War book. The subtitle there is War Against Civilians. And Michael quotes the Nuremberg court, which acquitted German Field Marshal, I think von Loeb was the name, who ran the siege on Leningrad, in which many civilians died, and ordered his troops to prevent the civilians from fleeing across the ice or through the lake to the east, south. And he was brought to trial in Nuremberg, but was acquitted because the court said that precedent in military law had recognized this as a legitimate form of warfare. Now, I've tried to ask colleagues who work in international humanitarian law today about whether this is still the case. And some said, no, this is no longer the case, and others said, well, it's not so clear. But at least at the time of writing, in 1977, Michael asserted that this is one of the cases where there's a clear divergence between law and ethics. And whatever international law says, or whether or not you can find such a person guilty for war crimes for running a siege in which he does not allow the civilians to flee, that is immoral, because that violates the core of the war ethic, which is non-combatant immunity. You're waging war by starving civilians, not as a co-product of something. It's not relevant to the doctrine of double effect. That is the tactic and the strategy by which you are trying to win. And you can, I think, even in that book, and certainly in later writings, you can feel Michael's joy in being able to quote Maimonides through Victoria, but Maimonides is quoted as the voice forbidding a siege in which you do not let the civilians out. Maimonides, who's actually relying on the rabbinic text, Midrash, says, when you lay siege to a city, it is impermissible to lay siege from 4 sides. You may encircle the city only from 3 sides, and you must leave the 4th side open so the civilians can flee. Michael adds that this seems to be written not from the perspective of the generals running the war, but from the perspective of the refugees. And this is, he begins the chapter by quoting the memory of the terrible siege of Jerusalem. He quotes Josephus about the siege at the end of the Second Commonwealth, but we also can think about Sefer Eicha and the Lamentations at the end of the first Beit Rishon, with the terrible descriptions of a siege. So for a people for whom that is central in their memory, saying no one, including ourselves, should be allowed to run a siege like that and commit that kind of atrocity was very significant. Michael adds by saying this is from the perspective of refugees, but at least given the alternatives, people have the right to become refugees. I should add, since I taught this book and this chapter more than once, I've always asked my students, what is the difference between a siege and a blockade? It's basically the same thing, but a blockade is on such a large scale that the option of allowing people to escape and become refugees, still in their own land, no longer can be relevant. I mean, if you're blockading Germany and you say, well, you should leave some side out so all of the Germans can escape, that's no longer meaningful or viable or legitimate. And in this case, it's very clear that Michael is writing with an ethical voice, criticizing what's accepted as international law, and saying proudly the Jewish political tradition teaches us that, well, it's not only the Jewish political tradition, but it's feeding into the just war theory in this instance and teaching us that that form of warfare is not legitimate. So I am not at this point going to engage into the question of pessimism versus optimism. Should we trust in God, as in the dollar bill, to lead us out of the contemporary troubles here and abroad? But I think that it's very clear, and this is what I learned from Michael in working on this project, that scholarship and commitment can and should be combined, so that we're trying to depict a broad array of the Jewish political tradition as best we can, but also remembering that this is important because it's our tradition, and as it's our tradition, it's part of our responsibility to engage it critically, to celebrate the meaningful and beautiful things that it teaches us, while remembering also to be critical of the ominous voices which it can include.
Thank you very much, Noam. So we have plenty of time to open the floor for discussion. So I suggest you suggest remarks, questions. We collect few of them, and you can write to yourself comments, and we'll make a first round, and then if time allows, we will do a second round. So please. I don't know. It's okay. Okay. Okay, please. Would you like to present yourself? Person in the dark. Person in the dark. In the light.
I think it would be good because we're recording that you use a microphone. So,
Oh.
Winnie, do you have a mic?
Not good enough that I stood up. Talking about politics.
That's enough.
Thank you. I know Michael mostly through his books, but I did spend a conference with him here in Jerusalem and walked away saying, I spent time with a Jewish mensch. And for me, that's sort of the highest, I mean, with all due respect to our intellect and our research, that's the highest compliment I can give. I'm Shlomi Ravid. I focus mostly on Jewish peoplehood as a field of research. I want to echo, follow up on what Yuli spoke mostly, even though I'm dying to analyze Bibi through the model of a sort of king, sort of God. But maybe that's for a different question. I think Dubno sort of laid the foundation for what we call today Jewish peoplehood. It wasn't called so then, and it wasn't framed as a discipline of a sort. But it resonates a lot with what I believe needs to be done today. I got an email 2 nights ago from an American, very active Jew, he's 80 now, who said to me, for American Jewry, and don't look at it from the religious perspective, Israel was the third temple. No more. It was really short, but extremely dramatic. And I think we need to launch a new paradigm of Jewish peoplehood. Noam Pianko laments how Zionism took over American Jewish thinking and contaminated sort of Jewish peoplehood. I think the current way out of the crisis, if there is a way out of the crisis, is the development of a new paradigm of Jewish peoplehood, which includes Israel, yet does not let Zionism dominate it. Okay. I'm curious how can this be brought about or advanced through Jewish political perspective thinking.
Thank you very much. I just want to ask you to keep your comments, questions short, so we can enable more people to engage in the discussion. So please, more comments, questions. Yes, please. Just a second, the mic.
I wanted to ask, why does it matter that the whole comments come specifically from the refugees and the ones being besieged and not the besieger? Because the besieger actually has the choice. I mean, it doesn't matter specifically the refugees. Wouldn't it matter more for the people who make the actual choices, who have actual power that to decide?
Okay, I'm not sure I got the point, but perhaps you understood what. Okay, we will comment on this. Thank you.
I think you spoke too quickly for most of us.
All right, sorry. So I'll turn it again. I asked, why does it matter specifically that those comments about morality come from the refugees, not from the besiegers? Wouldn't it matter the other way around, since the besieger is the one that is actually responsible for the choice?
Okay. Oh, okay. Okay. Thank you very much. Who else? I have a question. If the state of Israel is so important and central, if the state of Israel is so important, why those volumes, instead of one, I think, weren't translated into Hebrew? It will. But two of them, all right.
The third is translated.
Right now, okay. So maybe we'll start, oh, okay. Where? You, please.
Yeah, the mic was close by, so thank you very much. That was fascinating. I have a question for Julie. It was
louder. Can you speak louder?
Oh, sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was humbling. I have a question for Julie about the question of sovereignty. And there's many times the question of just sovereignty is about the question of is sovereignty necessary or not necessary? But there's also the question of, well, sovereignty is also split between needing to defend the sovereignty of the people, and then on the other hand, it has to also defend the rights that also limit itself. So it's kind of split and in a paradox. So I was wondering if you could say a few words about that and whether it's relevant also to this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Who else? Okay, so let's start the first round of answering the questions. So perhaps Julie, would you like to start?
Sure. I'll say briefly with respect to the last question. Right, sovereignty is both internal and external. Right, that sovereignty finds in its classical theorization finds its expression in the self-determination and the self-rule of the people, who, at least in a democratic system, are the sovereign. But sovereignty also involves an external dimension, in the sense that a sovereign state is supposedly in control of its own affairs and not subject to external dictates. And I think you could argue that today both of these facets of sovereignty are in crisis in Israel, and not just in Israel. But I'll just say that in the most sort of gestural and suggestive way without elaborating, but we could talk about it at greater length later on. Regarding Jewish peoplehood, I am in fact in favor of reviving it, and I actually think that, again, inspired by Dubnov and inspired by Michael and inspired by the Jewish political tradition, I actually think Davka, it's the left that needs to reclaim this concept of Jewish peoplehood. And I think, the historical circumstances and the current crisis, which has many facets, but I think one of the most striking facets of the current crisis is the extent to which the Jewish question has resurfaced and has, it's in the newspapers every day, linked to topics that seemingly have no connection to Jews and Judaism, such as immigration policy, the purpose of the university, deportation policy. So this surprising, to me at least, resurgence of the Jewish question and its emergence as one of the defining political controversies of our time, I think does make peoplehood that much more urgent, because suddenly there are issues of shared political concern that don't unite Jews around the world. Arguably, they separate Jews around the world, but they force Jews around the world to be in a very contentious conversation. So I personally think that we should revive the concept as a form of grassroots political mobilization that takes advantage, that puts Jews around the world, in critical Jews around the world, in conversation, that mobilizes the different forms of political and social capital that Jews have in Israel and in North America, for example. And I think that reviving this concept especially because it is Dubnovian in origin, actually does provide a powerful form of leverage and critique of the state, both the nation state in Israel, which no longer gets to define the boundaries of the Jewish people, but I think it's also a form of, it offers us a Jewish critique also of the pretensions of the United States, which impose a a religious definition of Judaism on American Jews because of that's the language that the Constitution and the First Amendment afford us. So I actually think that peoplehood offers a form of leverage and critique against the pretensions both of the nation state in Israel and of the liberal state in the United States, and that it can also be a source of powerful political organizing in this very desperate moment that we find ourselves in.
Thank you. Thank you. Sandro? אתם רוצים להגיב? אפשר. אוקיי. מוישי? Okay.
I just wanted to say, sorry, is this
No,
on?
it's okay.
It's on?
Here, yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
Just wanted to say something to Noam, to the wonderful presentation. One of the things we thought about over the years were, what are the borders of our discussion, as you beautifully put it. And I'll remind you that with regard to the second volume on membership, I thought that that we should include Paul's critique in Romans against the boundaries of rabbinic Judaism, and I was outvoted. And that's fine. That's these. I think this is one place where we don't eat each other up because we've decided otherwise. But it was a tough decision, and Michael said it. I suggested at one point. Well, maybe we'll put it a chapter from Romans at the end of. At the end of volume 2 as a kind of appendix, and Michael said, no, we can't do that. That would be like putting a yellow star on him, and at the risk of metaphors upon metaphors. Yes, the question. I think ultimately, I thought that Noam was correct in saying that that Paul initiates a new tradition, a new religion, a new tradition, and this was a good argument, but I think it would make a better balance against some of the voices that that we've included that I thought were profoundly problematic. But that doesn't matter. We can think that they're problematic. We want to surface the arguments, and that was a very important thing we wanted to do. And I'll mention another thing that Michael always used to say, that we want to present this tradition warts and all. We don't have we have problems, and we have to allow. We have to allow a range, or at least some kind of framework in which we can reflect also upon upon not only what we take to be noble moments and sublime moments, but what we take to be disastrous moments, and they differ in different communities. In different Jewish communities. This ongoing conversation seems to be a necessary condition of the kind of commitment that we have. Now, some of it is bad, but I think we also succeeded, at least in creating a reflective grid. What more can you want? That we are not engaged in policy, but we want to create a reflective grid. We want a place where people can say, oh yes, I know that this can be recognized as a voice in my tradition, but I want to reject it, or one I think that has to be another voice that I think should be much more a much more powerful one. In this sense, we try to create an ethic of a bet midrash, but it's one that we've always tried to write from a place of commitment. This was one of the things that Michael wrote in trying to typify what does a social critic do? He reminds us of what we know. Yosef Raz found that, of blessed memory, found that unsatisfactory. He thought that the more transcendent or transcendental moment of moral critique is a better position. And I think I'm with Michael on this. I think that we constantly have to remind ourselves about what it is we already know. We somehow look for the possibility to connect with something that'll help us be engaged. At least that's my feeling about it.
Thank you, Menachem. Moshe, and then Yair. Okay. Okay. So, okay. And Shira. Okay. Where's the mic? Oh, can you just pass it on? Yeah, pass it. Thank you.
Just to make a very short comment and to comment on what Noam said and also Menachem, I was part of the first volume, writing it together with the group, and I have to say that I never understood this problem as one of the members, because that's, when you edit a book on the Jewish political tradition or any kind of tradition, you basically don't agree with most of the views. And that's not a problem. So if you really are disturbed by the views, you have to basically throw away, I would say, almost 90% of it. Now, it's not a matter of, one text or another. It's a matter of a real big chunk of text, and I didn't see any problem with that. I'm not writing my own views. I'm just analyzing, views that we find within the tradition, and, when you think about this, Ginsburg is okay. It's not really different from any, rabbinic texts. Just elaborating a bit more, that's it.
So what's the importance of the project?
What?
So what's the importance of the project? If 90%...
The importance of the project is like the importance of every scholarship. Now, if you want you want a discussion about the importance of scholarship,
okay,
that's not the place to do it. But if you agree that scholarship is an important, project, this is part of what we do.
Okay, thank you, Moshe, please. Okay, Shira.
This was implicit in some of what you said.
It's on,
okay.
Yeah.
This is implicit. I don't remember who brought this up in what way, but Michael has written a great deal of important material on the question of a nation state and a civic state. And right now, this is a blow-up topic in the world, as the American right is moving towards its notion of a Christian nationalism, and the question of obviously liberal and illiberal constitutions. So I wanted to invite you to say more about that, given that most of the Jewish political tradition, and here I think it's clear what you want to bring are texts that are valuable to discussion and thinking about politics. And I don't think it's only about agreement or disagreement, it's about what texts are usable. Most of the texts were written in the diaspora, obviously, except for the Bible, though it depends how you define diaspora. And how can these texts be brought to bear? This goes back to something that was already said on questions of how you constitute a liberal national state, but also a civic state that has community. And these are core topics in Michael from involuntary association, and I'm inviting you to think about that.
Okay, thank you. Okay, over there.
Thank you very much. Sorry for the does it work? Yes. Sorry for the bluntness of the question, but I think it's kind of follows the question that I've been asked about the fact that most of the Jewish political tradition have been elaborated during the Galut. And today I think we should grasp the fact that we are in a very unusual situation, even from the biblical time. For the first time, we have a state that, for the best and the worst, is a regional superpower, 10 million citizen strength and nuclear arsenal, which is something completely unusual even compared to biblical time, where Malchut Israel and Malchut Yehuda were also kingdoms really vassal statelets, completely at the mercy of the great regional superpowers. And so, considering how unusual this situation is, how can we use our political tradition, especially the text from the Tanakh? I think of the tradition from the book of Shmuel or the book of Menachem, to conceptualize the risk and responsibility of our current situation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, last comment, and then we will open it up here.
Thank you very much. I wanted to ask, in this tension between mundane politics and messianic politics, and the preferring mundane politics, and what space is left for the messianic idea, or like Mashiach in general?
Okay, thank you. Okay, so perhaps each and one of you, if you would like to comment.
I'll just comment on some of these things. Yair, you said that 90% of the text we don't agree. I think that we may disagree on the meaning of agree. Because how you relate to a text is a question of interpretation. And from medieval times, people beyond the Jewish realm have found roots of democracy and human equality in the Bible, in the book of Genesis. Now, is that phony? Is that real? No. For John Locke, was that a real inspiration for human freedom? Those are valid questions, but I don't have the same experience of wanting to reject 90% of the text, but I do want to emphasize that it wasn't, as I said, it's not a question of disagreement. That is, there's a difference between pluralism and relativism. There's even a pluralist has limits, so you can include happily many things with which you disagree or agree partly, or whether you agree depends on how they are interpreted. But what I was talking about in the first example that I cited was something which is beyond which ought not to be tolerated, and yet is part of the tradition. So in the commitment to scholarship, it should be included, but you need to do something about that. That was just, and in terms of the question of, I should also say that part of what I've discovered in working in this is that there are very powerful roots in the Jewish tradition for affirming the rights of minorities and of individuals. So that if there is an argument about, a kind of shallow democracy, a slogan about, the voice of the majority should prevail, and whatever the majority decides, that's okay. So when we want to oppose that from a democratic tradition, I think part of what we're trying to do is also to reinforce opposing that from a Jewish tradition position.
It works. No, I don't want to. I don't want to insert myself into the question of the value of scholarship and the nature of scholarship, but I do want to refer to another project of Michael, which is called the Paradox of Liberation, which I learned from it the following insight. Regardless of scholarship, etc., if we think that handling the current crisis is not going to lead us to engage the demons of our tradition, and not only that, raise a serious religious counter voice, I mean religious counter voice that is there, by the way, there will be a big mistake, because part of what's driving our crisis is not only the way Israel is shaped, but the way the tradition is shaped in that discussion. And there are some people who feel, I think rightfully so, that they want to engage in that argument, and it's fine to engage it. You know, it's not going to be publishable in Tarbitz, which is fine, but it's utmost important to engage it thoroughly and to use every possible source there to create an alternative, and not to allow the voices. By the way, some of them is complete, as far as I read them, ultra-nationalistic abuses of traditional language. I, after all, grew up among good, pious Jews. So I want to bracket the question of scholarship, because I know that parts of Michael's thrust is to understand that it's not going to be a way of reconstituting Israel's political life without engaging Judaism in a serious way, because it's part of the problem. And part of engagement will be to raise a counter voice. By the way, Noam mentioned the law of siege. When I went to the army as a young soldier, we had a Rosh Yeshiva, Baron Lichtenstein, and he said, "You're going to war, and I want to remind you this law that you have to leave the fourth wall open." By the way, it wasn't yet the wars of siege and starvation, it was different wars. But why did he bring it up? Because Nachmanides said, this is a mitzvah from the Torah, this is a commandment, a say in his, Nachmanides is also a Jew, he's not Ginsberg, but a Jew. And he says, why? Because to teach you compassion during war. That's what he said. Now, it's very different from what other voices are there, and it's a voice. And I would say the following, in the spirit of Michael's work on the paradox of liberation, that without a serious engagement with the problem, it's not a comment on scholarship, seriously, it's fine. But without a serious engagement with this issue, serious, both with its demons and its values, those who are good-willing Israelis are going to lose that struggle, because it's a voice there that is powerful, dominant, and unfortunately it's being abused. And part of the tragedy is that that's the projected voice of whom we are and what we are. By the way, shameful voice. But that's just a comment in the spirit of, I would say, another of Michael's works, engaging that discussion. But I would restrain myself on that problem, because we have to go to a break.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much for wonderful lectures and discussion.